Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on a period that's both fascinating and heartbreaking.
Yeah.
The fall of Salvador Allende and the rise of Augusto Pinochet in Chile.
Right.
And we're going to unpack a really interesting set of sources you provided that I think paint a very vivid picture of this tumultuous time.
Yeah. What strikes me is the sheer complexity of this story. It's this tangled web of political ideologies, economic pressures, Cold War anxieties,
Yeah.
and ultimately human choices with devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And it's not just dates and names. These sources bring to life the individuals caught in the middle of this political earthquake, from Allende himself, the democratically elected socialist, to the everyday Chileans whose lives were upended by the coup and its aftermath.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks.
Right.
You know, it's made up of real people,
Real people.
real lives, real tragedies.
Yeah, let's start by setting the stage.
Okay.
It's 1970, and Salvador Allende, this charismatic socialist, wins the Chilean presidency in a very tight race.
This was a pivotal moment. For the first time in Latin American history, a Marxist leader had come to power through democratic elections. Allende's vision for Chile was bold. He wanted to redistribute land, nationalize key industries like copper mining,
Yeah.
and create what he called a democratic road to socialism.
These reforms, while aimed at social justice and economic equality, were met with resistance,
Yes.
both domestically and internationally.
Yes, Allende's policies alarmed powerful interests, including large landowners, industrialists, and, of course, the United States. The U.S., in the midst of the Cold War,
Right.
saw Allende's socialist leanings as a direct threat to its influence in the region.
Yeah, and we see evidence of this in some of the declassified documents that you provided. The Nixon administration, deeply concerned about the potential spread of communism, authorized covert operations to destabilize Allende's government.
It's fascinating to see how these covert operations unfolded. Yeah.
They funneled money to opposition groups, fueled anti-Allende propaganda in newspapers like El Mercurio,
Wow.
and even explored options for a military coup.
It's almost like a political thriller playing out in real life.
Yeah.
A democratically elected leader facing a campaign of sabotage and subterfuge from a superpower.
It certainly had all the elements of a high-stakes drama.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that the U.S. wasn't alone in its opposition to Allende.
Right.
There were also internal divisions within Chile itself.
Right. Allende's reforms, while popular with his base, alienated many in the middle class and business sectors.
Yeah.
They worried about the economic implications of nationalization
Right.
and the potential for increased state control.
As Allende pushed forward with his reforms, the Chilean economy began to experience turbulence.
Okay.
Inflation soared, shortages became common, and a black market flourished. This economic instability further fueled opposition to Allende, creating a climate of uncertainty and anxiety.
So you have this perfect storm brewing.
A polarized society, a struggling economy, and a superpower actively working to undermine the government. It's a recipe for disaster.
And that's precisely what happened. In June of 1973, a group of military officers, frustrated with Allende and emboldened by the growing unrest, attempted a coup d'etat. This event, known as the Tancatazo, involved tanks rolling into the streets of Santiago and firing on government buildings.
It must have been a terrifying sight. What happened? Was Allende overthrown?
The Tancatazo ultimately failed.
Okay.
Allende loyalists, including armed civilians, repelled the coup attempt. But the writing was on the wall. This failed coup exposed Allende's vulnerability and emboldened those plotting against him.
And it's at this point that a figure we've heard a lot about emerges from the shadows, Augusto Pinochet.
Pinochet at this time was a relatively obscure figure. He was the army commander,
Okay.
but he had a reputation for being a dull dog, a loyal soldier who followed orders. Even the CIA, in its assessments, dismissed him as a potential coup leader.
So how did this seemingly unremarkable man become the architect of one of the most brutal dictatorships in Latin American history?
It's a combination of factors. Part of it was sheer luck. The commander-in-chief of the army, General Carlos Prats, was a staunch constitutionalist opposed to military intervention in politics. But a bizarre incident occurs. Prats gets into a very public altercation with a housewife who insults him.
What?
This damages his reputation and forces his resignation.
Wow, talk about an unexpected turn of events.
Indeed. And who steps into Pratt's shoes? None other than Augusto Pinochet. Suddenly, this seemingly unassuming general finds himself in a position of immense power
Yeah.
at a moment when Chile is teetering on the brink of chaos.
It's like fate, or perhaps some would say a tragic twist of irony, had placed him in the driver's seat at this critical juncture.
And it wouldn't be long before he took the wheel and steered Chile down a very dark path. So with Pinochet now in charge of the army, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in Chile's political landscape. It wasn't long before he joined forces with other military leaders who shared his disdain for Allende's socialist policies
Right.
and his perception of growing disorder in the country.
So on September 11, 1973, the coup that had been brewing for months finally erupted. You've given us some chilling accounts of that day.
Yeah, it was a day that forever changed the course of Chilean history. Fighter jets screamed over Santiago, bombs rained down on the presidential palace.
La Moneda.
La Moneda, yeah. And soldiers stormed government buildings, encountering fierce resistance from Allende loyalists.
And Allende himself, where was he during all of this? Did he flee?
No, Allende chose to stay and fight. He barricaded himself inside La Moneda with a small group of loyal supporters, determined to defend his democratically elected government. It's really remarkable to listen to his final radio address, which you included in the sources.
Yeah. I was struck by his defiance, his courage, in the face of certain defeat. What did he say?
His words echoed with both sorrow and resolve. He spoke of his love for Chile, his commitment to democracy, and his refusal to compromise his principles. He knew he was facing death, yet his voice remained steady, almost poetic, as he declared, "I will pay for loyalty to the people with my life. I will not resign. Placed in a historic transition, I will pay with my life for the loyalty of the people."
Knowing the tragic outcome of that day, it's incredibly moving to hear him speak those words.
You can almost hear the gunfire and explosions in the background as he delivered his final message to the Chilean people. Shortly after that broadcast, La Moneda fell to the military.
And Allende, how did he die? There's been a lot of speculation over the years.
Initially, the military claimed that Allende had died fighting hero's death, but later evidence, including eyewitness accounts and a 2011 forensic investigation, strongly suggests that Allende took his own life rather than surrender to the coup forces.
A tragic end to a man who had dedicated his life to social justice and democratic ideals. What happened in the aftermath of the coup?
The coup ushered in a dark period for Chile. Pinochet, quickly consolidating his power, established a military junta and suspended the constitution. A wave of repression swept the country, targeting anyone suspected of supporting Allende or opposing the coup.
The sources paint a horrifying picture of the human rights abuses that followed. Thousands were arrested, detained without trial, tortured, and killed.
Yeah, it's a chilling record of brutality. Secret police roamed the streets, stadiums were transformed into makeshift prisons, and the bodies of disappeared victims began to turn up in mass graves.
You mentioned stadiums being used as prisons. Didn't they use the National Stadium where soccer games are played?
Yes, imagine that. A place of sport and celebration transformed into a symbol of terror.
Yeah.
Thousands of people were held captive in the National Stadium, subjected to horrific conditions, torture, and interrogation.
It's hard to fathom the suffering that took place within those walls.
It's a testament to the regime's cruelty and its complete disregard for human rights. And it wasn't just the National Stadium. Other sites, like Villa Grimaldi, a former cultural center, were also used as clandestine detention and torture centers.
Are there any specific cases of individuals who suffered under the regime that stand out? I know the sources mentioned a few.
Absolutely. The case of Victor Jara, a popular folk singer and Allende supporter, is particularly tragic. He was arrested, taken to Estadio Chile, another stadium used as a detention center,
Oh, wow.
and tortured. They broke his hands, the hands that created such beautiful music,
That's hard.
and then they executed him.
It's hard to even imagine the brutality he endured.
His story is just one of many. Another case that gained international attention was that of Charlie Horman, an American journalist who was in Chile during the coup. He was detained by the military, and despite efforts by his family and the U.S. Embassy to secure his release, he was tortured and killed.
I remember seeing the film Missing, which was based on his story. It's a powerful portrayal of the fear and desperation felt by those caught in the regime's web.
These individual stories really bring home the human cost of Pinochet's dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
Behind the statistics, the cold numbers of those killed and tortured are real people, with families, with dreams whose lives were shattered by the regime's brutality.
So Pinochet has seized power, he's unleashed a campaign of terror, he's silenced any opposition. What happens next? Does he just rule with an iron fist indefinitely?
Well, Pinochet, while consolidating his power, also began to implement a radical economic program that would have lasting effects on Chile. It's quite a contrast to the socialist policies of Allende.
I'm curious to learn more about that. Did this economic shift play a role in Pinochet's grip on power?
Absolutely. In many ways, Pinochet's economic policies were as radical as Allende's, but in the opposite direction. He embraced a free market model, privatizing state-owned industries, slashing social spending, and opening up Chile to foreign investment.
So a complete reversal of Allende's socialist agenda.
Exactly. Pinochet surrounded himself with a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys because they had been trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, a leading proponent of free market capitalism.
It's fascinating how these economic theories born in the halls of academia found their way into the policies of a military dictatorship.
It's a testament to the power of ideas and the often unexpected ways in which they shape history. But the implementation of these free market policies had a profound impact on Chilean society.
What were the consequences of this radical economic shift?
Yeah.
Did it achieve its intended goals?
The results were mixed. On the one hand, Chile experienced significant economic growth under Pinochet. Inflation was curbed, foreign investment poured in,
Okay.
and certain sectors of the economy flourished. However, this growth came at a cost.
What do you mean?
Well, for starters, there was a dramatic increase in income inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor widened significantly. Social services were cut, unemployment rose, and many Chileans struggled to make ends meet.
So it's a classic case of the benefits of economic growth not being evenly distributed.
Precisely. And beyond the economic consequences, there were also social and political costs. Unions were suppressed, dissent was silenced, and the regime's grip on power tightened.
It seems that Pinochet was using these economic reforms not just to reshape Chile's economy, but also to consolidate his own power and eliminate opposition.
That's a very astute observation. Pinochet's embrace of free market policies was not simply an economic experiment, it was also a political strategy, a way to align himself with Western powers like the United States, which had a vested interest in seeing Allende's socialist experiment fail.
And it worked, didn't it? Pinochet remained in power for 17 years. But he wasn't overthrown in another coup, was he?
No, his downfall came about in a way that surprised many, and it reveals a fascinating twist in this whole saga. In 1988, after years of repression and growing resistance, Pinochet, perhaps overestimating his popularity and control, made a fateful decision.
What did he do?
He agreed to hold a referendum, a yes or no vote on whether he should remain in power for another 8 years.
He must have been pretty confident in winning, right? After all, he had been in control for 15 years at that point.
You'd think so. But beneath the surface, there was a groundswell of opposition to Pinochet's rule. People were tired of the repression, the disappearances, the lack of basic freedoms.
Though no campaign emerged.
Yes, and they ran a brilliant campaign. Instead of dwelling on the regime's brutality, which could alienate some voters, they focused on themes of joy, hope, and a brighter future for Chile. Their slogan was simply, "Joy is coming," which resonated with a population yearning for change.
It's amazing that a campaign focused on positivity was able to topple a dictator. What happened when the votes were counted?
It was a stunning victory for the pro-democracy movement. The no side won with 56% of the vote, a clear repudiation of Pinochet's rule.
Yeah, Pinochet accepted defeat. He stepped down gracefully.
Well, not quite. He initially resisted the results, even pressuring the military to annul the vote. But the momentum for change was too strong. The international community condemned his attempts to cling to power, and even within the military, there was growing pressure for him to step aside.
So after 17 years of iron-fisted rule, Pinochet was forced to concede defeat. What happened next?
In 1989, democratic elections were held in Chile, and Patricio Aylwin, a Christian Democrat who had opposed Pinochet, became the new president. It was a triumphant moment for the Chilean people, a return to democracy after years of repression.
It's an incredible story of resilience and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most brutal of dictatorships. But Pinochet's legacy, as we've seen in these sources, is incredibly complex and controversial.
Absolutely. He remains a deeply polarizing figure, both in Chile and internationally. To some, he's a villain, a ruthless dictator who destroyed democracy and committed horrific human rights abuses. To others, he's a hero, the man who saved Chile from communism and laid the groundwork for economic prosperity.
It's interesting you mentioned that some people view Pinochet as a hero. I know one of the sources you provided was an excerpt from a podcast where Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, defended Pinochet even after he stepped down from power.
Yes, Thatcher's unwavering support for Pinochet is a fascinating aspect of this whole story. She saw him as a Cold War ally, a bulwark against communism in Latin America. She was willing to overlook his human rights abuses and even visited him in England when he was under house arrest for crimes against humanity.
It's a stark reminder that history is often written by the victors, and that even figures hailed as champions of freedom can have blind spots when it comes to their own political agendas.
Indeed. And it highlights the importance of critical thinking, of challenging narratives,
Right.
and of seeking out multiple perspectives when grappling with historical events.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this pivotal moment in Chilean history, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listener?
I think it's this. The story of Allende and Pinochet is not just a Chilean story, it's a human story. It's a story about the fragility of democracy, the seductive appeal of authoritarianism, and the enduring struggle for freedom and justice.
It also reminds us that the pursuit of economic progress should never come at the expense of human rights,
Right.
and that the ends don't justify the means no matter how noble the stated goals.
Exactly. And as you delve deeper into these sources, I encourage you to consider the choices made by individuals on both sides of this conflict, the forces that shape their decisions, and the lasting consequences of their actions.
It's a story that continues to resonate with us today, reminding us that the fight for democracy is never truly over, and that we must be vigilant in protecting it from those who would seek to undermine it, both at home and abroad.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that even decades later, Pinochet's legacy continues to spark debate and division. He died in 2006 without ever facing trial for the crimes committed under his regime, which I'm sure adds to the complexity of his legacy. Absolutely. The fact that he evaded justice fueled resentment and frustration among those who suffered under his rule. And it also raised important questions about accountability, transitional justice,
Yeah.
and the long shadow of authoritarianism.
It makes you wonder what might have been the fate of Chile had Allende not been overthrown. Would he have been able to achieve his socialist vision? Or would the country have descended into chaos, as Pinochet's supporters claimed?
That's the great what if of history, right?
Right.
And it's something you can continue to ponder as you explore these sources and other accounts of this period. It's impossible to know for sure what would have happened, but it's a thought-provoking exercise to consider the alternative paths that Chile could have taken.
Yeah, one thing that struck me as I was going through these sources was the resilience of the Chilean people. They endured years of repression, but they never gave up hope for a return to democracy.
Their story is a testament to the enduring human spirit, the desire for freedom and self-determination. They organized clandestine resistance movements, they documented human rights abuses, they kept the flame of democracy alive even in the darkest of times.
And ultimately, they succeeded. Chile transitioned back to democracy, held free and fair elections, and has built a thriving economy. It's an inspiring example of a nation overcoming a dramatic past and rebuilding itself.
It's a testament to the power of collective action, the importance of truth and reconciliation, and the enduring belief in the possibility of a better future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this complex and fascinating period, what final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the story of Allende and Pinochet offers valuable lessons for us all. It reminds us that democracy is precious, that it requires constant vigilance and engagement, and that it can be fragile in the face of authoritarianism.
Yeah, it also highlights the importance of remembering the past, of learning from history's mistakes, and of holding those in power accountable for their actions. Because ultimately, as we've seen in the case of Chile, the pursuit of justice and the defense of human rights are essential for any society to truly heal and move forward.
And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can prevail, and that the fight for freedom and democracy is a fight worth fighting.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fall of Salvador Allende and the rise of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. We encourage all our listeners to explore these sources and many others on this topic.
Absolutely, it's a fascinating story.
Until next time.